years after its first publication, the poem The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe remains both a masterwork of American literature and a chilling adventure in horror. Enrich your Halloween season by experiencing a dramatic recital of The Raven by easy for me to say, by poet Jeffrey Zygmont. How'd I do, Jeffrey?
Zygmont.
Zygmont, yeah, I got there.
It's close enough.
In addition to reciting the 18 stanzas of The Raven, Jeff will give a brief review of the life and works of Edgar Allan Poe. He will also provide some background and commentary on the poem to make your enjoyment of The Raven more thorough. And for refreshments, he'll serve Raven cutout cookies and apple cider, mulled as it would have been during Poe's final decade in the 1840s. So Jeff is the author of poetry collections of White Mountain Poems and More White Mountain Poems. He is a writer and poet who lives in the Merrimack Valley, and he speaks regularly about poetry and art at venues across the region. So all 40 of us or so, let's give a big round of applause to Jeff.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you. Thank you very much to Robert. Thanks most especially to the Tewksbury Library for this opportunity to come here and speak to all you people, recite to all you people. And thanks most especially, honestly, to all of you for coming. I speak as often as I can. It's always nice to get a nice, good-sized crowd like this. So I am Jeff, as Robert said. I am a poet, and I come to the poems I recite as a poet. Two of my books that are out are White Mountain Poems and More White Mountain Poems. It was as creative as I could get with the title for the second one, but I wanted to make the point that they were a family. But we're not here to talk about my poetry. I speak like this to promote poetry because it is my love. And there is a fine canon of American poetry by some very, very fine American poets who preceded me and who I could only wish that I could, somehow not equal, but work in some way worthy of them. And one who I'll start with, who's not Edgar Poe, we'll get to him very soon, but our own Robert Frost. Since it is October, right, one of Frost's most beautiful poems. It's hard to say, he had very many. But Frost is our own. He was born in San Francisco. When his father died, his family, his young sister himself, and his mother moved to Lawrence, Mass. They were very poor, lived in tenements. They were destitute. Frost just kept working and working. He taught school for a while. He raised chickens at a homestead in Methuen, Mass. So Frost is most closely associated with New Hampshire, but he does have a lot of history, of course, in this part of Massachusetts. And he was in southern New Hampshire, Salem, where I happen to live, and Derry, and a little further up. But Frost's poem October captures this month perfectly. October is a bittersweet month. It's beautiful. It's very beautiful, not just the colors, although that's a part of it. The quality of the sky, the quality of the air, it just inspires us. It makes us feel good. But that's the sweet. The bitter is, we sense it's ending. The nicer weather is ending, cold things are coming. And Frost expresses that kind of feeling, those dual aspects of October in his poem, which is simply titled October. O hushed October, morning mild, thy leaves have ripened to the fall. Tomorrow's wind, if it be wild, should waste them all. The crows above the forest call, tomorrow they may form and go. O hushed October, morning mild, begin the hours of this day slow. Make the day seem to us less brief. Hearts not averse to being beguiled, beguile us in the way you know. Release one leaf at break of day. At noon, release another leaf, one from our trees, one far away. Retard the sun with gentle mist, enchant the land with amethyst. Slow, slow. For the grapes' sake, if they were all, whose leaves already are burnt with frost, whose clustered fruit must else be lost, for the grapes' sake along the wall. Robert Frost, just capturing October very beautifully in that poem. Thank you. As a poet, the hardest thing of that poem are those, it's written in octameter, 8 syllables per line. Oh, hushed October morning mild, 8 syllables. Every line is 8 syllables, except those 2 lines. 5 lines up, slow, slow. 2 words, 2 syllables. What do you do with that? When you recite it, you have to stretch those words out as long as the other lines. But as a poet, I read that and think, the genius of this man to do this sort of thing. But overall, he just created this very, very wonderful poem. Moving 100 years before Robert Frost, who operated mostly the earlier part of the 20th century, to Edgar Allan Poe, born 1809, not long after the founding of our republic here, our wonderful American republic. Born 1809, died just 40 years later, 1849, the age of 40. Did some wonderful work in between. Poe is known as the parent of the detective story for many of the short stories he wrote. He's known as a literary critic. He was very profuse, writing for many literary magazines, doing criticism of other works, and he's known most especially as a poet. The Raven was published late in Poe's life. Again, it was a short life, but The Raven was first published in 1845. Just 4 years before he died. It was a hit immediately upon its release, and it's pretty much stayed that way ever since. And of course, it's kind of a dark and foreboding and eerie poem, so we associate it with Halloween, and that's why I'm doing it now. I will, before we get into the poem itself, there's a few terms and words that aren't familiar to us. Again, it was written in 1845, 160 years ago. Language evolves, language changes. So I like to review just a few terms that will come up in the poem that we may not recognize. It'll enhance your understanding of the poem to know what I mean when I get to those parts. But first of all, embers. We all know what an ember is, obviously, a little burning coal or charcoal. But the point I make here is that in Poe's time, and we forget this, we have central heating. It's a little high right in here. But in Poe's time, he would have heated with the fire, obviously, either coal or more likely wood, but one or the other. And Poe sitting late at night, or the narrator of the poem sitting late at night, would have been warming himself in front of a fire. So when he speaks of embers, he's speaking of his heat source, but he's sitting in front of a large fire. I won't repeat the line till we get to it. But anyway, when I talk about embers reflecting their ghost on the floor, it's just the glow from Poe's fire. Pluto was the Roman god of the underworld. The Roman god of death was Pluto. So Plutonian, the word Plutonian, which comes up a couple times in the poem, refers to kind of the realm of the dead. Hades, we could say, in Greek mythology. But Plutonian, Poe will talk about the Plutonian shore. It's the realm of the dead, coming back from the dead, where he suspects this raven may have come from. Pallas, who is more commonly known to us as Athena, the Greek goddess Athena. She was the ancient Greek goddess of wisdom and truth. She had other roles too in ancient mythology. A lot of these gods and goddesses represented a lot of different things. But Athena was primarily the god of wisdom and truth. And there is a bust of Athena in the chamber of our poet, or of our narrator, and perched above the door, just as we have here. So when I mention Pallas, it's the Greek goddess Athena. The Balm of Gilead. Gilead comes up first in the Old Testament. Again, this term Balm of Gilead, we don't hear it much anymore. It refers to a soothing balm. Gilead was kind of like a promised land, a land of milk and honey. So when you speak of the Balm of Gilead, it's a place of soothing. So the Balm of Gilead will be mentioned in the poem. Will I get relief? is what the poet is asking when that comes up. Aiden, A-I-D-E-N-N, is a word for paradise. Again, not used much anymore, and it is more of an Arabic term, but it means paradise. So you could say heaven, you could say paradise, or you could say Aiden, as Poe does. The color purple is the color of mourning. It's also the color of royalty, other things, but purple is mourning. That's why in some Christian services it's used during Lent to show mourning. But twice in this poem I'll mention purple, once violet, and the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain. That means his room or his home is decked out in mourning. Okay, he's mourning a death. Surcease, S-U-R-C-E-S-E, just means cease, a stop, an end to. Beguile, that was in the Frost poem I just recited, means to fool, to trick. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, as we'll hear, means the bird tricked him. He was feeling sad. This bird cheered him up, but by guile, by tricking him. A censer, which will come up. C-E-N-S-E-R. That's a vessel, a hollow vessel used to burn incense. It's used in Catholic masses, I think in Episcopal, maybe some other religions, but as part of the rite of the Mass, incense would be lit in the censer and it would be swung by the priest or by some officiant, and it would spread the incense throughout the room. So that word censer is basically an incense burner that's typically swung. Nepenthe, N-E-P-E-N-T-H-E. That's a word I've never seen before in this poem, but it's basically just an elixir, a soothing balm, something you would drink and bring forgetfulness, okay? Quaff, oh, quaff this kind nepenthe. He's saying, drink this elixir so I may forget, so I will no longer, feel despair over the death. And quaff means simply to drink. Last word, it's not on my cheat sheet, is obeisance. Obeisance just means tribute and honor. Not the least obeisance made he. That just means he walked in like he owned the place. He didn't pay, tribute to the person or even politeness, just walked in like he owned it. So, going back to 1845, in the words of the great Edgar Allan Poe, we have the Raven, which occurred on a midnight, dark and dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, as I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping as of something gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Only this and nothing more. Oh, distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon my floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain chilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now to still the beating of my heart I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door." Some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more. Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, or Madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is, I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping, tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token. And the only word there spoken was the whispered word, Lenore? This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, Lenore. Merely this, and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning. Soon again I heard a tapping somewhat louder than before. Surely, said I, surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more. Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Now, while I'm placing our raven on the bust of Pallas, I'll point out this is one of two transition points in the poem. The raven enters, and our narrator or poet, Staybird, our poet has been in despair. We'll hope he stays. And the raven enters, and it beguiles him, tricks him, cheers him up. He has a pet. And as it'll turn out, well, you'll see. But it's a changing point in the poem. His mood changes. Then, this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven, ghastly, grim, and ancient raven wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast, upon a sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name as nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I, scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, nevermore. Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, doubtless, said I, what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore, of never, nevermore. But the raven still beguiling all my fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease, reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining with the lamplight gloating o'er she shall press, oh, nevermore. The second turning point, he turns back. Lenore re-enters his mind, and he begins to suspect this bird isn't a pet. There may be something more sinister going on. Then, methought, the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer swung by seraphim, whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath sent thee by these angels, he hath lent thee respite and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh, quaff that kind nepenthe, and forget that lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempt or sent, or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate, yet all undaunted. On this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aidenn It shall clasp a sainted maiden whom the angels name Lenore. Clasp a rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked, upstarting. Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor, and my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. Edgar Allan Poe. So that's what I have, which I hope was enough, but I'm happy we can all stay here and chit-chat. Questions or comments. And also, I meant to mention this at the beginning. Sorry I didn't, but if you want to get up for more cider and cookies, that's just fine. It would not have bothered me during the presentation, and certainly wouldn't bother me now. But we can chat. People can offer comments or whatever. But that concludes the formal portion of our program. Yes, sir?
All right, so listen very intently, very, very well done. The literary symbolism is rich, but we all know ravens don't talk.
Yeah.
So now, is this his imagination, or is this actually a talking bird?
Well, I don't think he was trying to describe an actual event. It wasn't, in other words, it wasn't based on a real, true story. And I'm not sure, are there any ornithologists in here? Do we know that ravens don't talk? I don't know. Crows, a raven is not a crow, but they're closely related. It's a little larger than a crow. They're, I guess, less gregarious than crows, but they're very similar birds. Crows have an incredible vocabulary. The noises, the sounds crows can make. It's more than just the caw we're all accustomed to. But I agree with you that a crow cannot, or a raven could not speak like a parrot. Or some of the other macaws, some of the birds we commonly think of as speaking. But again, it's a metaphor. The raven is a metaphor, I believe, for despair. There's the symbolism here is we have the Greek goddess, beautiful Greek goddess of truth, of wisdom, but, she's kind of dominated by despair, who will not leave, will never leave our narrator, our poet. The despair is with him always, or will be with him always, and that's pretty much the message of the poem. So it's symbolic. Yes, I don't think we're supposed to. Well, then in fact, during the poem, the poet himself is surprised. Much I marveled, this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly. It surprised the poet as well. But yes, I don't think we don't need to take the bird as actually, a speaking bird for the poem to have the strength and impact that it does. Yes, ma'am, in the back?
And who knows what and how much he was quaffing to.
How much of that kind Nepenthe he was quaffing, right? Yeah. Whew.
Did Poe suffer a personal loss that was a
Well, yeah,
news for
yes, personal, and it's another thing we have to remember. Human perception, we tend to see everything the way it is today and think that's the way it's pretty much always been. But, Poe died at age 40. Frankly, in that era, it wasn't all that unusual. Although Poe lived a pretty rough life. He may have worn himself out a little prematurely, but it wasn't that unusual to die at that age. Both his parents died when Edgar Poe was age 2. He was adopted by a Richmond, Virginia merchant named John Allan, A-L-L-A-N, hence his name became Edgar Allan Poe. Poe married his 13-year-old cousin. I think she was 14 when they got married, but 13 when they became engaged. He married her very young, and she died. She predeceased him. So yes, he had seen a good deal of loss, to answer your question. To my knowledge, no one named Lenore, but that worked so perfectly with the rhyme structure. Poem was just a musician. Again, as a poet, I approach these things, and that line, and the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain. I mean, I'll read a line like that and fall over because it's so well done and so beautiful. You had a question, miss?
Oh, well, we were talking about how ravens can't talk. He actually originally did write the story with a parrot, but he decided that
Oh, really?
it was ominous enough, which
Yeah.
I understand.
Yeah.
So that would kind of answer the question as to why he chose a nonverbal bird. He, just like any of us, we probably would have been like, that's not as scary as a raven.
Right. Well, that's right. Yeah, and a raven, it's all black. It is kind of an ominous-looking bird, and so no, I hadn't heard that though. I didn't know originally there was a parrot.
I was told that crows are very social birds.
That crows are, yeah.
They talk to each other, and if a human being is nice to one of them, they tell each other, and those crows will be nice to that human being. That's what.
Yeah, well, it's possible. Crows are they are very social, and from what I've learned, one of the differences, ravens tend to be more solitary. Crows kind of gather more in groups. We would call it a murder of crows, a flock or a group of crows. But yes, crows are social birds. I'll be out walking in the woods, which is what I do a lot, but I'll hear sounds that I wouldn't expect to hear, and they're coming from crows. So again, it's not just the common caw. And I've also heard that crows have distinct calls to identify things they see, like human and other animals, predators and whatnot. So they're very intelligent, crows and ravens by extension. They are quite intelligent birds that I've read. Yes, ma'am?
Can you speak to some of his short stories? You mentioned that this poem was popular almost right away.
Right.
Unfortunately, it was only 4 years before he died.
Right.
All of the short stories, I had heard that they were criticized. When did they sort of come into being? Like, did he?
I think he had a fair amount of commercial success with his short stories. He was different. He stood out from the writers of his day, and a lot of people didn't know what to make of him. But I think he published a lot. There were a lot of periodicals back then. Again, this was the first half of the 19th century before the Civil War, a long time ago. But there were a lot of literary journals, literary magazines. There were a lot of places to publish things. And he published quite a bit, and I think for the most part they were well accepted. He had a good reputation with editors. They liked his work. They took his work. So he was always, he was very poor at managing money, so he was always scrambling for a dime, scrambling to keep a roof over his head. But in terms of his literary prowess, I think that was recognized during his day, although they didn't, again, quite know what to make of him. But The Raven, again, it was an instant success, and some of his short stories, The Telltale Heart, Fall of the House of Usher, I think those were popular and remain popular. And as I said, he wrote early detective stories that, what is it? There's an association for everything, but there's an association of mystery writers, and their annual award, like we have the Oscars for movies, the annual award for mystery writers is called the Edgar. and that's after Edgar Allan Poe. So he's still recognized, but I think he was successful, but he didn't make much of a living at it. That's not much different from today, I suppose. Yes?
One thing that came to mind was, it comes to a point in the poem where he realizes that raven isn't going anywhere.
Right.
It's a resignation. It's almost like grief, where they say, you never get over it, but you get used to it.
Yeah. Yeah. He shall be, at the end, my soul from out that shadow shall be lifted nevermore. And that's kind of, in his case, despair wins. He realizes that's where we end at the poem, or that's where the poem ends, is that his despair will be eternal. And that's kind of the raven's message, or what the raven represents to the speaker, to the narrator. But yeah, things you never get over. I think he's trying to express a deeper level of despair, that he won't get over this. He can't just pack up and go, that he's going to be in this shadow forever, and the raven represents that despair to him. Again, a blackbird, not a bright, colorful parrot. Make sense? Sir?
Do you know how he died?
I was just reading. He took ill. He'd been on a bender. Poe could go on drinking sprees, and he took ill, and I think just the natural causes back then. I mean, it wasn't any kind of, there was no mystery surrounding it or anything, but he fell ill, and a few days later he died. But again, any illness back then, if it could grow into an infection, you'd get pneumonia or something. It was, as I said at the beginning, wasn't all that unusual to die at such a young age of 40. Whereas, we're fortunate. We have penicillin and all the antibiotics that have come after that. Marvelous, marvelous things that keep us alive, help keep us alive today. We have good nutrition. We have good sanitation. I like to say, doctors help us. But one of the reasons, this is totally off subject, by the way, but doctors are good. Doctors help us, but the people we should really thank for our good health are the farmers and the plumbers, because we're very well nourished and we have good sanitation. And that's what killed a lot of people in earlier eras. But you take things for granted. The world is just like this. But we can be grateful for that we're fortunate to have been born in a prosperous era. Totally off subject, I'm sorry. Didn't mean to proselytize. Miss?
To add to that, I actually just visited his museum this summer in Richmond, and they said one of the newer theories coming out is that it could have potentially been rabies even.
Oh, rabies, Poe's death.
One of the newer theories that they've been doing a lot of work on, because they can't come up with a concrete reason.
Right.
But rabies is one of the
Well, and there was no way to treat it then.
Right.
And I'm sorry, did you say that was in Richmond? You were at the Poe? Yeah. Yeah, he's closely associated with Richmond, where he lived at times and worked. More closely associated with Baltimore, I think, where he did the bulk of his production, his literary production. But he also lived in New York. He lived in Boston. He was born in Boston. His parents were theatrical. They were actors, an actress and an actor, and they traveled a lot. So I think Poe was actually born in Boston, but he was in Richmond when his parents died. But they would move around a lot, in stage shows, basically. But that's interesting. I hadn't heard that. But yeah, and I didn't know. Like I said, the most famous statue of Poe there's one in Back Bay now in Boston, but the most famous statue of Poe is in Baltimore. But I wasn't aware of the Richmond Museum. But yeah, he is closely associated. He did a lot of work in Richmond.
Southern Literary Messenger magazine.
Yes, he was one of the editors of the Southern Literary Messenger, and he would write a lot of reviews. He was very prodigious, I guess. He wrote a lot. He was very productive. But again, just he didn't have the healthiest lifestyle, and he was he could be kind of tempestuous. One anecdote is, again, he'd been drinking. He had an interview or a meeting with, I believe it was President Tyler at the time, in Washington. Obviously, this would have been very near Baltimore. But he came to the meeting with his jacket on inside out. I don't know how you could even get a jacket on inside out, but so yeah, he was different. He was different, but a genius. And again, this poem, it startles me with the originality of the way he puts words together, and again, just a genius. Sir?
Did he write a poem called Annie, or it was another woman's name?
There's a famous poem he wrote called Helen, to Helen of Troy. I'm not as familiar with Poe's work as I am with some other poets, American poets, so I'm not sure. I don't know of a poem.
I think it was Poe who was traveling,
Yeah.
doing a show or
Right, yeah.
whatever, and he went to Lowell,
Oh,
met a couple, and they invited him back to stay, and he ended up having an affair with the wife.
oh, okay.
He'd come back and visit the wife.
Right.
And he ended up writing this to her, I believe, and then after her husband died, I think she changed her name.
That's interesting, yeah. So
there's a real close connection.
So Lowell has two famous literary connections, right? Poe and Kerouac. That's not bad. That's pretty darn good. But anyway, that's very possible. Poe, there's a number of poems that it's known, and I don't know of any titles, but a number of poems where it's known, particularly when he was younger. He would write a poem for a woman, but then recycle it perhaps, and send the same poem to several women he was courting, either in sequence or all at once. Yeah. But no, that's highly possible. But I don't know the poem Anne or Annie. He's famous for the beautiful lyricism in just a 3-stanza poem called Helen, referring to Helen of Troy in this case.
He's got a poem called Annabelle Lee.
Annabelle Lee is, yeah, that's a very famous Poe poem. So that could be.
Well, it's another one where, the woman is lost.
Right. Yeah.
There is one, she just said for Annie.
Okay. Oh.
Yeah, her name was.
So those little screens really are handy. Yes?
Her real
Do you
name
think
was Nancy.
there's more poems of his that we haven't uncovered? Like, have we uncovered them all?
Probably. I'm not a literary scholar, and I'm sorry, you weren't here at the beginning. I'm a poet myself, so I'm not a literary scholar. I read these people's works to inspire me and also to instruct me. I started with Robert Frost, my Lord and Master. The same with Edgar Poe. But in Poe's case, I kind of doubt it. He's very well renowned and he published a lot. Now, you never know. Letters turn up, papers turn up, so things get found. But to my knowledge, I think it's felt or is widely believed that Poe's repertoire is pretty much complete. What he wrote is out there. It's known, as far as I know. Miss in the back?
I was just going to ask you, write me one of your poems.
Recite one of my poems? I speak regularly about artistic inspiration, and one of the poems I use is titled November. It's a little bit appropriate. It's very short, but if you're out in a day like this, and you feel that blast of cold wind, you're very likely to turn and say to your companion, you can really feel it, winter's on the way now. Now from a poet, in this case me, you may get something like this, titled November. Denuded slope, the trees are bare, the leaves have dropped, the birds despair, the wind is cold, the sky is bleak, the grasses fold, the branches creak. November's toll is taken now, soon blizzards roll and mountains bow. Or, actually, now that I'm thinking, high color, the splendor of these autumn leaves seeps deeper than a mind conceives. Mere chemistry inflames this hill, plant tissue minus chlorophyll. But knowing soul transforms the sight from optic twitch to high delight by reading autumn's buoyant hues as pictures of celestial views. Just to conclude, about my own work, since you asked, I'm a public poet, and that's my own term. What I mean by that is I write for a general audience, people at large, and a lot of poetry today has become a little too specialized, too hard to understand, and it's scared away a lot of people. I never set out to be a poet, I set out to write poetry. And because of that, I emulated some of the classic poetry, and I still try to write in terms and that people can understand without being graduate students at Harvard in an English program or something, or at University of Lowell at an English program. So yeah, that's my approach. So the poems I recited, they're for you, not for what I call the literary set. So that's hard today because a lot of people kind of dismiss poetry because it's hard to get. A lot of it is just hard to understand. I don't write to be hard to understand. I write to move you the way I am moved by the things that inspire me. That's the essence of art. That's what I speak about often. But an artist sees beautiful things and has to tell you about them, whether it's in painting or poetry or what have you, music. Make sense? Good.